The Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, presented by DraftKings. Bit of a shift in sports media over the past week or so. There were layoffs at The Athletic, the continuing layoffs at ESPN. Other places out on the West Coast have been firing and laying off or disintegrating jobs in content media. There's a radio station in Canada that was owned by TSN that went completely under. In Edmonton, they took it completely off the air. So jobs are disappearing in the sports media space at a time when sports media and sports content demand is at an all-time high, which is really interesting. So I don't really have a grasp on really what's going on. So I wanted to bring in someone who's been around the industry, been around some of these layoffs over time, I'm guessing. Sure. So Steve McAllister, my former instructor when I was in broadcasting school. Right now, you are the editor-in-chief of Gaming News Canada. Obviously, you were with Yahoo Sports for a really long time, and you've worked in a lot of traditional sports media over the years as well. So thanks for coming on, for one thing. And two, I mean, how many cycles of this have you seen over the years?
Quite a few, Pat, and it's on one hand it's great timing for you and I to chat. On the other hand, it's lousy timing given what you laid out a second ago about the layoffs this week at the Athletic and TSN 1260 in Edmonton shutting down yesterday. But to be completely candid, it's one of the reasons why I got out of the sports media business in 2016. Right before the Rio Olympics in Brazil, I had informed my bosses at Yahoo Canada that I was stepping down as managing editor of sports there. I was really disheartened by the layoffs I'd seen at our place and cutbacks of some of the coverage, and we'd let go some bloggers, and we had lost Nick Kotsanika, our National Hockey League columnist, and it just, it's funny. I went home one night a week before the Olympics and just said to my wife, I can't do this anymore. And was quite emotional about it. And, luckily, as you found your place and your voice in the sports betting industry, I kind of got a second chance here with Parlay Media Group and starting Gaming News Canada back in February 2021. And while it's not exactly making me a rich person one right now, it's certainly been a labor of love, and I really enjoy getting back to my roots as a journalist.
Well, the one thing that I've noticed is that we'll get to the Athletic in a second, because it seems like it should be a really good revenue model where it's subscription based, although you can get it for $1 per year as a sign up bonus. And they had done something, they'd raised over $100 million from venture capitalists before they sold to the New York Times. The original founders kind of double dipped on the money that they were getting from that. But since the Athletic went under the umbrella of the New York Times, they have doubled their subscription base. They're up over 3 million subscribers. So they only laid off 4% of their workforce. So is this them throwing in the towel on certain beats? I saw they moved a bunch of reporters around to different beats. Or is this just like a natural cleanse of the workforce where, hey, we have some redundant jobs? And listen, I've worked at a lot of places. Not every employee you have is going to be really great. So maybe there's some time to get rid of some.
Yeah, Pat, listen, covering sports is an expensive proposition. When I was sports editor at the Globe and Mail between 2000 and 2009, we had a staff of 25 people. That included, we had Lauren Rubenstein covering the golf as a freelance columnist at the time. Tom Tebbett was going out to all the Grand Slams for us as a freelance columnist as well. With our full-time staff, we had a travel budget of about $1 million a year. And just talking to a few people around the industry this week, that I think that's one of the reasons why the Athletic made the decisions they did, or the New York Times, is because the Athletic, I think, had an awful lot of beat writers. So there are travel costs associated with doing that. And as you've seen, Pat, the Athletic did go out and hire a lot of high-profile journalists since its launch. And again, you're paying those journalists a lot of money. And my understanding is that, because some former colleagues of mine joined the Athletic, and they were paying very competitive salaries and made it quite easy for those people to make the decision to leave traditional media and join the Athletic way back when.
Yeah, it seems to be sort of a running theme where, when you're a startup, the only way that you can kind of buy credibility is either to match, overpay, create great incentives for people to come. And then once it starts to get to the point where you actually need to churn out a profit and not just create all this new revenue that investors want to get it. And eventually they want to get their money back. And then all of a sudden you need to start cutting costs, because we're seeing it at ESPN as well. They went through one round of layoffs, and this is just overall something that's happening at Disney in general, that you cut X amount of people, the stock price can go up a little bit, but it's really strange. And I think it kind of leads to where sports media is going at the moment. So they cut all these jobs on the back end, producers, researchers, whatever it may be in Bristol. And then they go out and they sign Pat McAfee to $15 million a year or whatever it was. And I think it just kind of shows that, are people just less concerned about, I don't know, I don't want to say legitimate journalism. I love Pat McAfee, but he's a personality. He has a big audience. And it seems like anyone who's getting any dollars or cents right now, I mean, he just left FanDuel, that if you're not associated with one of these gambling companies who have all the money right now, how are you going to pay for anything?
Yeah, that's a really fair assessment, Pat. And then one of the things that really drove me crazy when I was at Yahoo, Marissa Mayer was CEO and decided to pay $1 billion for Tumblr, which just made no business sense at all. And at the same time, Yahoo was laying off people and laying off engineers, laying off editorial people. And they imposed Tumblr, the Tumblr platform, on our editorial system, which made no sense at all. And it does have that feeling of chasing the shiny object. It's funny. Craig Daniels, who was the deputy sports editor at the Globe when I was there, we had a visit on the weekend, and we were talking about having 25 people when we were there at the Globe, and that department now is down to 3 writers, a sports editor, and 1 copy editor, and it just, and I think that's just not the Globe and Mail. I think that's common at media outlets across North America. And you made a good point at the top of this segment, Pat, and it is a time where there's so much going on in the world of sports, and it does seem really ironic at a time where we're seeing more sports, women in sports. You're seeing emerging sports like pickleball, believe it or not, and then just the sports betting component of that. It doesn't make a lot of sense that you see media outlets trimming staff and trimming resources.
Do you think that's because there are people who are self-sufficient enough now to run this themselves? Like, for example, I always kind of point to this because I think it's been such a success story that Andrew Patterson in Winnipeg, he was at the local TSN affiliate there doing a drive time radio show every single day. I remember talking to him, they got their staff cut. A lot of people got laid off, and he left to go start his own venture. So essentially he's doing a very similar thing. He's covering exclusively Winnipeg sports. And there's probably very limited like athletic beat writers for Athletic Winnipeg, if that even exists, which I don't know that if it does, that he kind of filled that void of, I am going to cover something very straightforward. It's going to be Winnipeg sports only, with a dash of if the Super Bowl is happening, just the bigger sporting events. But primarily, my audience are people who care about these sports in particular. Now he has become sort of the voice over there, but the big difference is he's not on salary from Bell and collecting pity stop options and making probably a pretty low salary. Now he can go out and get advertisers. He can go out and own all that content and sell it for whatever he wants, monetize it in podcast form and video form, sell it off to third parties locally if they want that on their air as well, and really drive engagement and be the voice that way. That's something that I know up here in Canada that TSN radio wanted to do. It was never super successful when they launched it because Rogers always had sort of a beat on that, but he's been able to get bigger than them. It's sort of the Athletic model, but it's independently owned. I always thought of an idea, and it would just take way too much startup fund, is could you create the Athletic with what he is doing in each individual city. I don't think that you could, because it would depend so much on the person doing it, and they would need to have the skills to be small staffed in order to create that revenue for themselves. But it does seem that if you can do this by yourself, your earning potential kind of goes through the roof now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Pat. I mean, you're a great, to be blunt, you're a great example of that. You've got to be a hustler. You have to have some business savvy. And in my experience, and I'll include myself in that, is that the sports journalists don't tend, for the most part, to have a lot of business savvy. So, so it is a daunting task, and also and I struggle with this a little bit in my role at Gaming News Canada, where I'm a journalist, but on the other hand, I'm also meeting with companies trying to get sponsorship and advertising, and as you can appreciate, that's kind of a slippery slope to ride. So the one thing I will say, I do think traditional media, newspapers in particular, I think really failed to properly monetize sports departments and sports pages. And during my time at the Globe, I would sit down with our salespeople and point at, as you mentioned earlier, Pat, major events. And I would say to our guys, like, listen, we've got Lauren Rubenstein and Michael Granger going to the Masters. Surely to God, we can get TaylorMade or Titleist or FootJoy or Callaway to sponsor a page in the Globe sports section for the week. And we have Lauren's column on that page every day, and we've got Mike Grange writing, and maybe, you do an interesting graphic from the Open. I think companies would have been all over that then, and there was just never the appetite for that. And, it's funny, I was talking to someone about this yesterday. I ran into a guy who's been a longtime handicapper who was telling me that he couldn't buy advertising in the Toronto Sun back in the day. And I remember working at the Canadian Press in the late 80s, and we would actually count the strip joint ads in the Toronto Sun sports section on a Monday, and it was usually, like, not a word of a lie, 21 to 30 strip joints in Toronto that were advertising in the Sun, and that was obviously that was monetizing and funding the Toronto Sun sports section at the time when the Sun had a really just a great roster of writers, and was an outstanding sports section in a highly competitive market.
So how did it work at Yahoo Sports when you were there? I mean, that's when I met you. When, like I said, when I was in broadcasting school, I met you as a new media instructor as we were going through everything. And like, I was using Yahoo a lot at the time. That was the first place that I played fantasy 20 years ago, was on Yahoo Sports. And that's still kind of the primary location of all of the home leagues with all my friends that I've had over that time, that we've just never switched off of it. So we're very familiar with what goes on over there. But it does seem like, I mean, that Yahoo Sports, for basically since its inception through, let's say, like 2020, was one of the premier destinations to go to get sporting news. It was up there with ESPN and CBS and all of the different places, the nationally, where you would kind of go. But it seems like it's fallen off a bit in terms of the traction. They launched Yahoo Sportsbook, but that doesn't seem to be doing anything. They have a daily fantasy game that no one plays. You mentioned acquiring things that make no sense and then laying off staff. It seems like it's been wildly mismanaged over the past 5 years or so.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Pat. I mean, when you and I were together at the College of Sports Media back around, I guess 2011, 2012, 2010. There you go. My first year at Yahoo. Yahoo Sports, what the model there was, Dave Morgan, who had been a sports editor at the Los Angeles Times, was hired by Yahoo, and he went out and effectively poached some of the best journalists in the country. So Adrian Wojnarowski was there at the time, basically kicking everybody's ass on NBA coverage. Dan Wetzel was one of the leading sports columnists in the country. There was a young Brit named Martin Rogers, who was just a fabulous storyteller. Jeff Passan was covering baseball, and I think Jeff's one of the best baseball writers today. And then also people like Charles Robinson, like the Yahoo was actually doing investigative stories into corruption in the NCAA and among NCAA programs. And when I got hired there in 2010, originally I had applied for basically a programming role on Yahoo Sports. They wanted to expand their Canadian sports property a little bit. And when I sat down with their people and they looked at my resume, they made the decision that, hey, let's bring this guy in and allow him to build a team. And at that time, we were placing a heavy focus on junior hockey because Yahoo in the U.S. had seen what their rivals' product had done, where people were paying a subscription fee to get college sports news from their alma maters, with highly successful. And Yahoo thought they could create a franchise there with junior hockey. And as you know, Pat, it's just a different model. In the States, Americans are passionate, crazy about college sports. They drive across the country to go watch their alma mater football team play every weekend, and that model wasn't going to work. But at the same time, we carved out a niche at Yahoo where we became a destination for junior hockey fans, and we brought in Sanaya Saperji to lead that coverage. Hired Nate Sager to be our blogger. And we kind of followed that Yahoo model. The other part of the secret sauce to Yahoo Sports at that time, if you'll remember, what were those blogs? And Greg Wyshynski, that's where Greg made his mark as the editor of Puck Daddy. And we had, Dan Devine and I'm trying to remember the other fellow's name, but Ball Don't Lie, the basketball blog. We had another guy who had a tennis blog that was getting lots of coverage. And again, I wish I could remember the brand names for these blogs, but our baseball blog was tremendous. And so it was that combination of really good journalism, reporting, opinion, and then the blogs where we were reacting quickly to things, to news that happened. And the other thing, Paul, Pat, I'm going on here, but the Olympics, Yahoo Sports completely owned the Olympics to the point where NBC Sports finally came crawling to Yahoo and said, we've got to do a partnership deal because on digital, you guys are absolutely killing us during the Olympics. Because Yahoo, just with the blogs and with their writers, I was one of 35 people at the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. I mean, there's no way. I don't know if anybody in North America comes even close to sending 35 people to the Olympics today outside of the rights holders.
Do you think that, in retrospect, let's say the next time that the Olympics come around in North America, so 2028 in Los Angeles, will most of these places just be sending one person to cover the major events, and then everyone else who's blogging on it or writing stories about it is just going to watch it on TV and report that way?
I think so. And we're seeing that now, Pat, where, papers are covering the Stanley Cup playoffs or NBA finals off the television. And that was sacrilege when I was at the Globe and Mail and at other destinations. But before that, newspapers for the most part have stopped sending photographers to the Olympics, which is a shame. And there's just a heavy reliance now on, if it's photos you're looking at Getty Images and the Associated Press and Reuters and the Canadian press. And if you're a newspaper or a website, you're also leaning heavily on the wire services to provide that written content during the games. And that's a shame. I mean, it's you can only do so much from a television set, and there'll be people out there who will say, well, look at Steve McAllister and Pat Mayo. They can write a game story off TV, or Pat Mayo can weigh in on the Leafs Jets games last night from his home studio and in the Maritimes. It's just different. Like being around a team, being in the dressing room, talking to scouts, talking to coaches, talking to other media people in person. Again, it just makes you better at the job, and it's just a complete difference trying to do a job from sitting in your basement.
It does seem like the only way that that's going to be viable going forward to actually send people to events is almost going to be an individual person owning a Substack blog or some sort of subscription site that they can monetize themselves, and then they will have to pay for the expenses to go do it, hoping that they can sell the subscriptions for enough that type of content is still so useful for people that they would want to go and do that. To get you can get 500 people who watch the game on TV and write their reports, and then this one person who is self-funded and selling subscriptions to it is going to be able to be on the scene, to be in the locker room, to provide you that sort of insight. Like, that's seemingly the only feasible way to do it financially without going bankrupt now.
Yeah, and I think sports organizations are going to have to be a lot more flexible in that accreditation process, Pat. And I think that's already started to happen. And you look at how many Twitter followers does somebody have, or how many subscribers on a Substack page, and as we've seen with Gaming News Canada, like writing newsletter on Substack has worked out quite well, and creating a podcast out of LinkedIn audio conversations every Thursday afternoon. That's doing well for us. I look at someone like Ken Campbell, the former Hockey News and Toronto Star hockey writer. Ken's transition, and he has a very good blog on Substack now. But yeah, the organizations are going to have to be flexible. It's interesting. We've Homestand Sports, we've really struggled with Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment trying to get media passes for the Maple Leafs and Raptors. And again, in fairness to the communications people at MLSE, they're getting a lot of these requests now. And I think it goes to your point that there are a lot of people out there, either people starting their careers or people who have left traditional media and trying to do their own thing now. And MLSE trying to figure out how do you say yes to this person, no that person, and there's also some nervousness too, just around the whole sports betting thing.
So I have a question about that, but I think the one thing that I wanted to hammer down on, based on a lot of the hires that were made, and I've seen it myself at either new media companies or startup video companies that all kind of gravitate around sports media, a lot of the times the people that are brought in to run these things are from some sort of old media. So if I'm starting up a random video company and I want to have almost like, let's just use Mayo Media Network as an example. So I have 12 shows on this network. I EP them all, and I have my producers that run the individual shows and the hosts that run the individual shows. But let's say I got a big VC funding. Someone gave me $50 million to blow it out, and I need to have 30 shows or, make those 12 shows go on every single day. And I thought to myself, you know who I need? Someone who's worked at ABC for 30 years to come in and really give me a hand. And it seems like it happened at old media. It happens at new media, that they just bring in these old hats because of experience. But the problem is, as we were talking about before the show, how unless you're really up to date on what the latest technology is, you're going to do everything in the most inefficient way possible if all you've known is these big budget projects over the years. And I've seen it cripple a lot of, like, especially startup video places where they bring in traditional TV people who worked in sports media who just have no idea how to produce content for the web.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You have to wear several hats. And again, we were talking off camera about taking on a more active role producing today, and that's part of the gig. And to be honest, that's why we have 6 founders at Parlay Media Group. 2 of us have longtime media backgrounds. I mean, Mike Day was at TSN for almost 30 years and produced the Sports Center show, ran the NHL Network. My resume. And we don't touch the homestand sports side of the business because we have complete faith in Kevin Kennedy, and Kevin's a guy who does have a unique and thinks outside the box, and he's surrounded himself with some good young people, both on the production side and the talent side. And I think rather than bringing some guy in who's got 25 years experience where you're going to have to pay him an awful lot of money, I would use that money to hire 3 or 4 people and develop people and help them find their niche, whether it's behind the camera or in front of the camera. The other thing I would say too, Pat, is you have to, if when you run these ventures, you got to think of how are we going to monetize this? And can we find a sports book to sponsor a show? Can we do a partnership with a sports book to use their people on shows? And I think it's just really easy to take VC money and just run with it. And that's not a path to a sustainable long-term business if that's the route you choose.
Yeah, I found in terms of profitability, if you're actually going to make $1.01 in the business, that the best way to do it is to just keep your costs down. Don't necessarily launch any sort of show that's going to be wildly unprofitable at the beginning. And that's what we've kind of seen with a lot of these bigger, especially people who have left large platforms and then gravitated towards doing their own thing now or starting their own production companies, they're getting bank for creating these companies, and they've brought their distribution with them, and they're able to build a very large platform. And most of it comes from the gambling companies spending, because they don't want, if DraftKings doesn't want this guy going to FanDuel, BetMGM doesn't want this guy talking about Tipico Sports or whatever it might be. There's so many of them floating around right now. The problem is when we talk about monetization, sometimes they're paying these people so much money that it's impossible to actually make any profit off of it for you. Yeah, it's good advertising, getting yourself out in front of so many people. But one thing that I'm actually kind of stunned that the sports books, I understand why they do it, because they want to acquire new customers, but they're going after a lot of viewerships and fan bases of these shows that just have people that aren't interested in gambling. It's hard to sell people who aren't interested in gambling on gambling. It might actually make them tune out of the show, or you're just flushing your money down the toilet to people who are never going to deposit anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And it's funny, I moderated a panel at the Canadian Gaming Summit here in Toronto yesterday with Connor Murray from FanDuel, Jared Bieber from Bet99, and Chris Abbott from Betano. And I do think that FanDuel with the TSN relationship has actually done a pretty good job integrating the FanDuel product into sports media and into TSN's quote editorial product. But we've seen a lot of examples, and I've been critical, like Sportsnet's really struggled. Sportsnet's really struggled with Hockey Night in Canada. I think a significant percentage of why people are ticked off is not just the sports betting advertising, but I just think Sportsnet hasn't been very sophisticated or very creative in integrating betting content into the Hockey Night in Canada broadcast. And I think a lot of people don't separate the betting content from the betting advertising. So that's been a stress point for them. And the other thing I'll say too, Pat, is back in the day, and it's probably before your time, there used to be something called advertorials in the newspaper business, and advertorials were a dirty word, and a journalist wanted nothing to do with an advertorial because basically you're writing a story on behalf of a company. And it tended just to be a lot of, branding BS and messaging and talking points. That's evolved through all forms of media. And now we talk about branded content, and you can actually do effective storytelling and integrate a brand into it. And it could be something simple as you sitting in your studio with a can of Coke on your desk, or something where you one example, talking about Sportsnet, BetMGM sponsored a segment during the hockey season called BetMGM Showdown. And all it was interviewing a former NHL player, sitting down for 2 minutes and having them tell some stories. That's, they're not ramming odds down your throat or money lines or same game parlays. It's just attaching their brand to a storytelling segment, and that works. And I think to be honest, Pat, traditional media are having a tough time just figuring out how do we cater to, do we need to cater to sharp bettors? Do we, how do we treat newbies and educate them? And I will say too, in fairness to everybody here, this is still early days. We're only 14 months into a legal market in Ontario. So, I don't want to be too critical here.
No, but I think you kind of hit the nail on the head about the integration. I mean, not that I sit down and watch a ton of hockey, but I did actually want to check out how these gambling segments were going to be integrated at both the major companies up here, because I've seen how they've done them, like on let's say like NFL Countdown, when Rex Ryan is giving out his DraftKings lineup on it. It's like, all right, he doesn't really seem to have any clue of what we're talking about here as it pertains to that. Because being, proficient at gambling is not exactly the same thing as being proficient analyzing a sport. I mean, a lot of it is just data driven. That's how this entire process is going to work. Now, I think that they want to appeal to people's emotions, and that's how you're going to get a lot of first time bettors. Like, hey, we're boosting up, like, to take the example of TSN or Sportsnet. Hey, the the Maple Leafs are minus 150 on the money line. But tonight, if you use promo code TSN, you can get them. You bet $100, you get $100. It's going to be even money if you go sign up, plus a deposit bonus. Like that actually makes a lot of sense in trying to sell it. The issue that I found, especially with both American networks and Canadian networks, and there are outliers with this, everyone who talks about gambling on these networks, unless it is a very specific gambling related show, seemingly has never placed a bet in their life, which hurts the content on both ends because it seems super forced, it seems super produced, and then the people who would actually want to bet on stuff or at least have some interest in it now have no interest because you're like, well, this isn't real. People are just like, I watched, there was some segment on TSN before they threw to a game at one point, and they were just reading odds. That was it. I mean, that's fine, but that's a graphic on the screen. This is television. It's a visual medium. You can throw that up. And like, there was no analysis, no insight, no what does minus 125 mean? What does minus 200 mean? Is there a probability attached to that? It's like, no, here are the first goal scorer odds. Minus 110 Connor McDavid, and just read out a list of 20 people. Like this isn't even TV. This isn't content. I don't know what this is.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll tell you with TSN, I mean, I like Mike Johnson and the Mystic or Magic Mike, whatever they call the segments, but Mike Johnson's a guy, and I interviewed Mike when I was writing the sports betting column for the Toronto Star a year or so ago, and Mike, like, he took pride and did his homework with those picks, and you know, I hate the word because everybody uses it, but it is authentic. Like, it's a guy who actually, you can, when you listen to him talk, you know he's placing a bet. And you know, he was like, he charts his bets because he says, I run into people at the airport and they're either happy with me or mad at me, but he says, I take pride in doing the work in that. And I think that's been one of the failings of the networks, Pat, is that they have shoved their personalities into a place to become you know, where they're promoted as sports betting experts by the content they deliver. And it just doesn't work.
No, and it's funny. I had Adam Schefter on the show last year for the Masters, and it was just funny to hear him talking about betting on golf and playing one and done on golf because that's what he likes to do. But it's good that he has never been framed that way as a sports betting expert. He's just someone who provides information. You mentioned Woj earlier, very much the same. But it does seem, and I don't know how prevalent this is going to be across like FS1 and ESPN. But what I've noticed in the Canadian side is that they are throwing these studio hosts. Now they're gambling experts, or they're not gambling experts, but that is now, when you start reading out odds, that's just how you're going to be perceived. So you need to find a way to integrate that where you're not putting all the onus on the person talking about it, especially if they're not making picks. At least try to frame it within the context of what's going on. Like, for example, like if you were doing a highlight package of a baseball game, you got the Dodgers and you got the Padres, let's say, that as a part of the Sports Center like highlight package, maybe you could start to include in, like, when they hit the home run along with their stat line, it was also like, hey, plus 475 to hit the home run in the game, something like that. So people can start seeing it normalized a little bit more without actual picks going along with it. It's like, oh, here's what it was. And maybe you can start to include probabilities. Do people just hate math? Is that the problem? They get really freaked out if they see like percentage signs on the screen?
I can tell you, as someone who barely passed grade 11 math, Pat, that you've hit the nail on the head with yours truly. I think this has always been a struggle. I remember when we relaunched globesports.com back in 2006, Neil Campbell, who was one of the executive editors at the Globe at the time. Neil's one of the best sports journalists this country's ever produced, and Neil was a guy who bet on horse racing. And Neil was ahead of his time, where he did charts and had spreadsheets. And when he sat down on Saturdays, that was, you know, his hobby was watching and betting on horse racing. He was doing the stuff that you're doing today and was prepared. And so when we relaunched Globe Sports, we said, let's do an NHL analytics column. And we found this guy who had his own website at the time, an actuary named Alan Ryder. And we provided him a feed we gave him a feed to the NHL data. And we had him write a column in it. It was a work in progress, but was thinking outside the box. And actually, James Myrtle with The Athletic now, James was at the Globe, and James had his own hockey blog, and James brought some of that analytical mindset to his writing. And again, it was, traditional media kind of sneered at James at the beginning, and it has come a long way. I think the trepidation, Pat, is just people having a hard time when they put numbers on a board explaining it. I mean, that would be my experience, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think that you necessarily need to dumb down a lot of the process for a lot of people, but I think that the biggest issue is you get thrown in the deep end, because you said, who are people trying to cater to? Are they trying to cater to the very casual fan? Are they trying to cater to the very advanced, sharp fan? And one thing that I've always tried to do on the show is, I mean, if you were to be dropped in on my show when we talk about daily fantasy or betting and you had no clue what was going on, we're not holding your hand every show, but my audience is people who are kind of into this. It's hard to pick up brand new people and try to educate along the way. But just, I actually don't know what the best way to do it is. I think that there is a happy medium between talking about things casually and talking about things on a more advanced level. I think it's easier to do in football season. And I think that's why, I mean, just the popularity of the NFL, and maybe the popularity of the NFL had a lot to do with people betting on it before sportsbooks were legal anyway, because it's a very easy thing to bet on. This team or that team is going to win. And a point spread in football is inherently a lot more intuitive than a point spread or a puck line or a run line or the spread in a basketball game. Like that stuff, even for me, it's not that it's confusing. It's like, I don't know what's a good line and what's a bad line versus what is a good line in football. It's like, oh, they're favored by a touchdown. They're favored by a field goal. That makes a lot more sense to me. And I think that's why football has had such an easier time doing that. But even to look at something, and maybe it's based on the way that we use the odds in North America. So if you call something even money, so you have plus 100 on the screen, or you have minus 200 on the screen, is there an easier way to articulate to people what that actually means? Because, I talk to my wife, I tell her, yeah, this guy, I bet on this game tonight. The Nuggets were minus 200. She's like, oh, what the hell does that mean? Like, well, I would have to wager $200 in order to win $100. And there's something to that last part of it that is really hard to communicate with the mass audience who might be gambling curious. Like there's some people that are just never going to convert. Like you have to be okay with that. But for people to understand it, even if you had no interest in gambling, my dad has no interest in gambling, but I do think that he would like to know as a part of a preview, hey, this team is minus 200 to win tonight. What does that actually tell me? Well, the sports betting market is setting it out that they think that this team has a 66% chance of winning tonight. I think that's easier to comprehend. At least 2/3 of the time they're going to win. Something just on that rudimentary level, I think gives people enough of a gambling education where they would actually feel comfortable making a wager at that point instead of just looking at these numbers that make no sense to them.
Yeah, and what you say, Pat, that makes so much sense for both the sports book and the media operator, the media company, because the sports book, that's, you want to get customers. So again, I'm not, I'm a $2 and $3 bettor, and I'm still learning. I'm still learning the lingo and the different the odds and everything else. So yeah, if you walk me through that and use 66% probability, that makes sense to me. And I think that's programming for, if you're a broadcaster, you can present that information and it doesn't feel like you're in an back alley with a trench coat and a fedora with a notepad writing down odds and handing it to the guy wanting to make the bet. The other thing I'll say, and it kind of comes back to the reason I'm with you this morning, is that if I'm a journalism program and I've talked to some sports management program people like at Brock University and Toronto Metropolitan University, there are a lot of opportunities in this industry right now. And I think it would be, if you're running a journalism program, especially in sports media, you should have a program where they bring someone like yourself in and teach the odds and the probabilities and making gambling understandable to an audience, because as we've both seen, there are a lot of opportunities to work in the media industry through sports betting.
So when I met you, it was probably 2010, maybe the very beginning of 2011. And I was writing about fantasy sports previous to coming to the college. I graduated university, started a blog, was writing at a site at the time, and then was like, well, I kind of like this. Let's see if I can get into the actual media part of it. See if I can get paid to do this, because especially then it was a very difficult to get paid a cent writing about fantasy sports, despite the fact that the business was booming. It really wasn't until daily fantasy came into the scene, 2014, 2015, that actual pay started to come along with a lot of this stuff. And then it just, those companies started throwing a ton of money around. But I mean, how long did you teach at the College of Sports Media?
Yeah, I was there 3 years. I'm thinking, Pat, you must have been my first the first year of the class. First year I was at CSM. So yeah, I ended up doing 3 years there, and then I did teach an online writing course for a semester in the sports media program at then Ryerson University before I left Yahoo in 2016.
So when you see students come in and we used to write, a sports column for you. That was the first task that we had to do. And I was basically writing from like a fantasy and gambling perspective. I would guess, especially where you were localized within Toronto, that, I don't know, 90% of people wrote like weird fan commentary about local sports, about here's why the Maple Leafs are broken and here's why they need to fix it and that kind of thing, where I just feel like that stuff doesn't play. Even at the time, it was at the back end of actually playing with real analysis. And it's funny because in that group of people that we had, you had me writing about fantasy sports, and James Herbert, who I believe is with CBS Sports right now, was writing about basketball on a very analytical level. Gary and Thorne, who's still on the show to this day, was writing about baseball from a very analytical perspective. It must have been strange to see some columns come in that were just, if 90% are the same, you have this 10% that are just bizarre based on what you probably expected coming in.
Yeah, and I know you slept through a lot of my classes, so you might not remember this, but probably the best advice I gave you and other students was to find your own voice, and that you had to find that secret sauce that was going to differentiate yourself from other people in the market. And that's why, when I think about my 3 years there, like your name comes to mind immediately, because you were doing something unique, and you had an immense amount of talent back then. And I'm not saying that because I'm here on a Zoom call with you this morning. James Herbert, I was thinking about James before his name brought up. I think of Peter Galindo, who was writing really smart commentary on soccer at the time. Israel Fear, who ended up coming and working for me at Yahoo Canada. Izzy was writing smart and doing things in a different way back then as well. So you and those other people, they stick out because they weren't just writing fanboy stuff or writing 250 words on why the Leafs should move so and so down to the third line or make a goaltending change. And that's not, I don't want to be disrespectful to other to your fellow students in the course at the time, but that's the reality. And if you look back, Pat, at your class and the subsequent classes that I taught at CSM and at Ryerson, it doesn't surprise me at all when I see the people who have been successful in the industry, because that was reflected in the work that they were doing back as students.
Well, it's funny. I saw a tweet the other day from Andrew Webster. So when I got a chance to know, he worked at the Score, he worked at Sportsnet, worked at TSN and the Score, I believe. And I mean, everyone who worked at the Score back in the day with Cam and Gabe and Rob Pizzola, Jeff Feinberg was there. It was a really great crew of people, and they seemed to have a ton of fun doing it. And then eventually, they sold. Somehow they sold their TV network and didn't include their app as a part of the sale. And the app was by far the most valuable thing that they had. So shout out to them for making some very savvy business decisions about what they did with their properties.
I always tell people, Pat, that John Levy is crazy as a fox. I mean, everybody, there are a lot of people that snickered at John when he hung on to the digital business and thought, what, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. And as the old saying goes, John's having the last laugh.
So basically what he said he's feeling for all the Bell employees. Bell owns TSN, working their sports media dream jobs that just got let go today. It sucks. Working in media sucks. Working in sports media sucks even more. And he quoted Gabe Morency, who says, if you're thinking about working in sports media, don't. And I think that you can think about that one of two ways. I think that the fact that it is a dream job for basically anyone who works in it, like everyone will tell you, this is why they got into it. They love sports. They want to cover sports. And I think that leads us down two really weird paths when it comes to it. You get a lot of cheap labor, and you can force people to work at the weirdest times, because if you don't do it that way, then you're never going to move up. I remember being told at the College of Sports Media, like if I ever wanted to get myself onto TV, the only way I could realistically do that was go take a job at a local affiliate in, buttfuck nowhere, Canada, and work there for 2 years in the sport. And maybe I'll get on the sports department and be the local sports reporter. And then I could go to a bigger market, and I would have to work my way up the chain to work back to Toronto to get on national TV. Now, fortunately, the technology had caught up at the time and no one was using it. They're like, hey, I have a camera, I have a computer, I have a microphone. I just put myself on the internet. That's much easier. Then I don't have to go to any of these places I don't want to go to, and I can talk about what I want to. But you see a lot of people, especially on cutting highlights, working on the radio row, like in terms of like just processing digital information that comes in, writing stories for the web, even associate producers on a lot of these shows, even producers on a lot of these shows. They don't make a ton of money. They work long and weird hours. They don't get holidays off, and they do it because they love it. And it does feel like a lot of these big companies have exploited that for so long that you get one of two things. One, people can't afford to do this job anymore. It just doesn't pay enough, especially with the cost of living going up in most of the major centers where a lot of these jobs actually exist. So for a long time, it led to the very same type of person being involved in sports media. They generally come from, I don't want to say wealthy families, but well-to-do families where their parents can support them while they're making absolutely no money working this job. And hopefully they can catch on and have a job that pays them well and they can move up. But without that safety net to begin with, there was no chance that they'd ever get or even start to try to get into the industry. So you had a lot of the same voices, especially behind the scenes, for a very, very long time. And I think that the internet has democratized that. It's made it cheaper in a lot of ways to be able to do that. But if you were going to get into it now, like if it was you and you were starting out, would you want to be cutting highlights at TSN, or would you rather be writing a blog for yourself and hopefully that adds itself up and then you can cash in on that and you're not at the whims of layoffs?
Yeah, that's a hard one, Pat. I mean, again, my career path wasn't easy. I mean, I worked 7 years at weekly newspapers. I mean, I was a small town kid from Eastern Ontario. I went and got a journalism degree at Ryerson, and I thought I'm going to have to work my way up to the food chain, and maybe if I get lucky, one day I'll cover the Leafs for the Toronto Star. And so I started in Kincardine, Ontario, for $125 a week in 1981. And yeah, same thing. Like I made enough money to pay my rent and pay a car loan. And when the car broke down, I phoned home to my mom and dad and asked if they could send me $300 to fix the muffler. But you have to love this job. And my wife, I'm going to be 63 in 2 weeks, and my wife's been retired now. She was a healthcare worker for 30 years. Really difficult work, a lot more difficult than what I've done. And she's often says to me, she says, "You'll never stop working," and that's because my work is my passion. You have to be really nimble. I mean, I think you know a little bit about my career, but I've taken a lot of different twists and turns. I mean, I often joke with people that my career has proven that I can't hold down a job. But I've been a sports writer, I've been a sports editor, I've been I've been a media relations person, I've been a consultant. I've been a marketer. I'm now covering gambling, and could 2 years ago, if you and I had this conversation, I couldn't tell you the difference between a money line and a parlay. And I still struggle with that, but I'm covering the industry. I'm not, no one's ever going to come to Steve McAllister for advice on who to bet on to win the US Open this weekend. I'd like to think I'm doing a pretty good job covering the industry. But yeah, you have to be willing to pardon the pun, bet on yourself. And a good example I'll use quickly, Pat, is Lucas Weiss. And I don't know if you've crossed paths with Lucas, but Lucas was a young graduate of the Centennial College program in Toronto, right around the time that COVID started. And Lucas started doing a podcast, and he would call everybody up. He called Stephen Brunt. I appeared on his podcast. The guy started getting some freelance writing gigs with the Star and Yahoo. And Lucas is one of the guys who survived at the Athletic this week. A good, young, talented guy. And I think I look at you, and so there are opportunities. If again, it sounds hokey, but it's true. If you're willing to work hard in this business, you can be successful. And I think if you and I are both honest, we look at people that I taught and that you were classmates with who aren't working in the industry now. And I don't think that would come as a surprise to you. And it certainly doesn't come as a surprise to me.
No, and you could almost see that at the time, the people that were going to stick through this and do it. But again, there was also there were some people that I went to school with that just had an awful lot of leeway. And it's funny because leeway financially, just a big safety net. It's funny because the people that ended up ultimately succeeding the most, not all of them, were the ones that basically had none of that safety net. They had to go make it happen as quickly as possible. And they did as most in a short period of time to get themselves into a position where they could be, financially able to pay their rent and pay their car loans and actually make a career of this instead of, like, I know one guy that did like basically 4 years of free work in terms of or minimum wage work, like cutting highlights. So he just, he lived downtown, had a really swanky place, parents footed the bill. Like, he was never going to advance. He had no incentive to advance. But when you start to take a look at these people, when we get back to the layoffs, it's more so in TV than it would be at the Athletic, because people at the Athletic have very specific jobs. And if the beat is not producing, maybe that's why people end up getting shifted around, or there's not enough money coming in from the subscriptions that they're selling based off a certain writer. I mean, I don't actually know the behind the scenes of it, but when we're talking about ESPN or TSN and these TV networks, the people who cut the highlights and things like that, they're essential to the process, but they're also highly disposable at the same time too, based on what management would think.
Yeah, and I think I do think you have to be somewhat ambitious, and especially in today's environment. If you think that you're going to be able to cut highlights for 25 years, I think that's a bit of a pipe dream. And so you have to be willing to learn new skills. I think you want to be willing to take on new challenges. And when I look back at my career now, Pat, like when I started my career, I was typing out stories on a word processor on a floppy and storing them on a floppy disk. And here I sit 41 plus years later, and I tweet like I did. I've handled social media for the biggest nuclear power plant in Canada during the pandemic, and we never would have seen that. I mean, I was Bob Goodeno's media relations guy talking to 100 reporters a day during a lockout in 1994 and 95, and when I was covering the Blue Jays for the Canadian Press in 1992, I could care less about collective bargaining agreements and franchise values and free agency and wanted nothing to do with the business of sports. And, I got to the point when I went to the Globe in 2000, now I'm doing segments on the business of sports every Tuesday night with Greg Sansoni and Martine Guyard up at the old Holiday Inn Hotel at Wayne Gretzky or Blue Jays Way, whatever it's called in King Street. So you have to be a fighter, you have to be a survivor, but I do think you can still have a very long and fulfilling career in this business. But you're right about you are right. It's that employers do take advantage, whether it's teams or leagues or we're really seeing it with national sports organizations, which are coming are under the spotlight right now with the abuse of athletes and that's a system where people just get churned. They go from one SO to the next, and we're seeing that's proven to be somewhat of a disaster. So if you want to work in this industry, you are definitely going to get taken advantage of at some point.
Last two things. How much do you think that AI writing, once it gets up to speed and is able to actually provide game previews or provide betting analysis, not necessarily like analysis, but give you a structure where, hey, here are the teams, here are the players, here are the lineups, give me the stats, give me like a 500 word write out, and I can do that for every single game. And instead of having 12 people write the 30 home team game previews from both a real life and then betting angle. You just have a computer do all of that. Then you have one person copy edit it to make sure that everything's right in it, touch up the wording a little bit so it sounds like a human made it. And then all of a sudden there are 12 more jobs gone.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely going to happen. I had that conversation with somebody who's in the sports betting business and on the media side yesterday, and they're already using AI to write. And as I said to them, I said, listen, it pains me as someone who's, made a career out of the written word. But who's going to pay someone $35 to write a preview of a Vikings Jets game when you can just put it through AI and like you said, have someone who can put an SEO friendly headline on it, give it a quick read and ship it out. And it goes back to what you and I were talking about before, Pat, and you and James Herbert and Peter Galindo and others, is that it makes it even more important that you find that secret sauce, and that's something special that makes you stand out from the pack.
I did notice that Yahoo Sports did hire it's a new role, president of Yahoo Sports. It's Ryan Spoon. He was at ESPN. He was the COO of BetMGM. He had been working with a company that I had been talking to, So Rare. It was like an NFT sports fantasy betting thing. I didn't quite understand it, so we didn't end up doing a deal. But now he's in the president of Yahoo Sports. Do you think you're going to, like we talked about, sort of the old hats coming in, running things the way that they've always known how based on their experience, and that doesn't really mesh up well with what the current landscape is in terms of video? However, do you think you're going to see more of these hires of people who have been around at a few places, but really they're at the forefront of, they have some sort of background either with a gambling company in the gambling space, and they're going to take over much of television sports production, or at least be in charge of that, the written word, because they will know how to streamline the monetization of these products?
I think that's the only way it's going to work, Pat. And again, I mean, 20 years ago, I would be, stomping my feet and jumping up and down and saying, no, you need to hire a journalist and someone who knows how to break news and do investigative stories. You need to start with someone who can actually monetize the business, so you can hire investigative journalists and hire a Woj and break news. And I think smart people realize that's the path is get someone in there who knows, can do deals with a sports book, can bring in the amount of revenue so that you can then invest properly in reporters, copy editors, graphic designers, social media people, camera people, producers, and actually put out a product that not only is excellent but is sustainable.
Last thing, you said you moderated a panel at the Canadian Sports Gambling Conference. What are some of the just interesting things that you heard from that conference? I know Pizzola was there. You were talking to him. I was going to come up, but I'd been away the past 2 weeks, and my wife wouldn't have enjoyed that so much. But I always find those conferences fascinating. I go to the fantasy sports one and gaming conference every February in Vegas. I haven't been to this one, but I'm always curious to know just some interesting things that people heard there.
Yeah, well, I joked at the start of the panel with Connor, Chris, and Jared yesterday that probably 75% of the people in that room, and the room was packed for that one, think that they're experts on content and wanted to be up on stage, and we were probably going to have a Royal Rumble. But it's true, right? I'm sure you get the same feedback from your audience. Everybody thinks that they can be a journalist, or can be a storyteller, or could be writing for a website, or creating their own Pat Mayo experience. That particular panel was interesting. Just hearing Connor Murray talk about how that relationship between FanDuel and TSN has evolved, and I think they're doing a lot of things right. Like the fact that when you go to FanDuel on a Leafs game night, they have the Leafs on TSN product, and you could place bets there. And the traders at FanDuel work very closely with TSN's editorial team, and so I think they've really found their lane there, even though it continues to evolve. And Jared Bieber, they've kind of leaned heavily into athletes and former athletes, and Jared had a great anecdote yesterday about with George St. Pierre. They don't have GSP, giving betting odds, but they have him present information. I think you touched on this earlier. he kind of talks about what he's looking at in the fight and how a certain fighter's trained, or the tendencies of the two fighters, and why he thinks that gives fighter X, or gives Pat Mayo an edge over Steve McAllister. And I like that idea of using that kind of information and insight from a former athlete to then take it to the odds and say, by the way, Pat Mayo is minus 250, but the way Steve McAllister's trained, I think he's a really good bet at plus 110. And so that was interesting. And then for Chris Abbott, Botano's a new player in the marketplace, so they're trying to find their lane, and they're working closely with JD Buckus on a podcast, and they're a sponsor of Ray Ferraro and Darren Drager's podcast. So there's discussions with those people and the producers as well. So that was really interesting. And then just on a high level, Pat, there's a lot of excitement about what's going on in Ontario right now. And, there's 45 operators in the province. Not all of them are gonna survive, but iGaming Ontario released yesterday a report that it had commissioned Deloitte Canada put out, and paints a really rosy picture. Things from the fact that 12,000 jobs have been created in this new industry in the first 12 months, and then more than $1 billion in revenue, with billions more to come. So. And I think it's just, it's a time where we're 14 months into this industry here, and there's just a lot of excitement about what's going on.
I'm always curious because no one ever says it at these conferences, but it's something that I don't know to be true, but very much believe to be true, that the only reason that these sports gambling companies actually exist is to get people on their site and try to convert them over to the online casino.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement, and there are some operators here in Ontario, Pat, who've made it quite obvious, or they say that sports betting is that's not their priority. Their online casino is what's going to drive their business, and I think that's fine. I don't play online slots. I'm not an online blackjack player, but there's certainly a market for that. And as you know, it's a contentious, it's a vice industry. So there's some struggles. The AGCO is looking at the advertising right now and looking at banning athletes and other celebrities from appearing in sports betting advertising. But if you look at what happened before last April, people, as you've been doing your business for a few years now. I mean, it's not like sports betting has been happening for a long time, and you can take people at what it's worth, but the belief is that a regulated industry is better. It brings in tax dollars. There are, I think, better responsible gambling programs, and for guys like you and I, it's created opportunities. And for me, when I get out of the sports media business in 2016, I actually end up going to work at a nuclear plant in corporate affairs. And I thought my journalism career was over, and being able to cover this industry for 2 years now and doing what we're doing with Homestand Sports has reinvigorated me professionally. And as I said, I'm going to be 63 on June 29th, and I'm still excited when I get up in the morning, and I love what I'm doing right now.
I like the idea that there is a lot of people watching right now to think like, well, I can do that. And the answer is yes, anyone can do this. And there's no barrier anymore preventing people from doing it. That's why we've seen so many individual success stories about people not going to have to grind in the middle of nowhere or paying hundreds of $1,000s for a journalism degree. I benefited a lot from going to the College of Sports Media. I learned how to use every piece of equipment, how to properly use it. But in 2023, I could probably just YouTube all that stuff, couldn't I?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit nail on the head. Some of the best broadcasters and journalists in this country, Pat, never went to journalism school. I mean, Dan Schulman, I think, was a finance graduate from Western University. Elliot Friedman was a Western grad, with nothing to do with journalism. Stephen Brunt I think he's a Western University grad. So yeah, you can work in this business, but it's not easy. Just a quick story before we wrap up. And I coached minor hockey with a guy in Brampton year when I was at the Globe and Mail. Both our daughters played, and he said one day about me, he says, I think I could do what you do. And this guy was like a project manager in the manufacturing sector. And I'm thinking, like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, I wouldn't even begin to pretend that I could be a project manager. And you're telling me that you could walk in the Globe and Mail tomorrow and become sports editor. A job that I worked for 20, 25, 30 years to get to that place to manage what was then, I really believe, the best sports section in the country. I mean, that was highly insulting. And I'm sure you hear that all the time as well, but it is a difficult business. And to your point earlier, it's not an 8 to 4 job. When the last NHL lockout ended, I got a phone call from Nick Kotsanika at 4:00 in the morning that there was a settlement, and I had to get up and edit a column and post it on the website. That's the norm. That's not the exception. So it's a difficult career, but it can be really rewarding. And as I said, I've again, not to sound cliche, but I really do feel blessed that I have had the career I've had and met so many great people. And again, those 3 years at CSM were a highlight of my career because of meeting people like yourself.
Do you
and
think
I say
we're
that
gonna...
sincerely.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I mean, I assume it's just from meeting me, not all the actual nice people that went to the school who were, were probably a bit better to deal with as students than I was. But do you think there's a reckoning coming for advertising, both in the US and Canada? Because I know that some states are already talking about it. Like, you just can't have sports betting. Because the same thing happened with DraftKings and FanDuel in 2016. And then New York State ended up banning daily fantasy for a while. And a lot of it just had to do with the obnoxious amount of ads that people were seeing on TV. It feels like that's happening again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say, Pat, I think that's great for guys like you and me because sports books it's easy to throw money at advertising and to place ads on a Super Bowl or Hockey Night in Canada or the World Series or a World Cup of Soccer. But now they're going to have to be a little bit more creative and not be so complacent. And that's been a challenge in Ontario because in the States, in Ontario, you can't advertise bonuses and inducements. And that I think was a problem for a lot of operators who came in this marketplace, where it was real easy in the US just to say, hey, have an ad basically with a pretty girl running around and saying, hey, if you get an account right now, we'll give you $3,000 in free bets. So I think what it's going to do is operators are going to have to look to people like Pat Mayo, look at Homestand Sports and create really good content that you can use to promote your brand. So I think it's a good thing for people who are making a living in sports betting media.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I would like people to come to me and back up a Brinks truck once my new deal is going to be all settled. That'd be very nice. My family and I would very much enjoy that. And I think the viewers would enjoy it too, because I've always put a lot of the money back into the show to keep it going and try to do more shows and try to do more things with it, because that's what I enjoy to do. Almost like you. It's like I do feel, I mean, blessed is big, but I feel very lucky that I get to do this. And I've been in the right place at the right time for a lot of this. Starting a podcast in 2010 turned out to be a huge advantage on people who didn't start podcasts in 2010, tried to start it in 2023. There was such a smaller pool of people to draw from and compete against at that time. And then you get this built-in audience. So can you tell everyone where to both find you and what you do want to promote to? If you're covering the sports betting industry, I think that's something that a lot of people would be into.
Yeah, if you want to read about the industry, Pat, Gaming News Canada is available on Substack. So, we offer paid and free subscriptions. I mean, I would like, it's nice when people pay for the product because I write about 6,000 words a week. We do Tuesday and Thursday newsletters. So there's a lot of good information. I also include job opportunities in the newsletter for paid subscribers. And then we, as I mentioned, I think earlier, we're on LinkedIn Audio every Thursday afternoon. We talk about the industry for an hour, and then we produce a podcast of that comes out on Friday. So again, you can find podcast on the Gaming News Canada page on Substack. And that podcast is also available on Apple and Spotify, and I think a couple of other podcast platforms.
Well, thank you for being on. I want to thank everyone for watching the show today. I hope the U.S. Open goes well for everyone. I hope you've learned a few things about the internal workings of the industry, because I did, and I work within the industry. There's always so much that you don't know going on with a lot of this stuff, whether, profits, layoffs, why people get let go, why people are consolidating, why things go out of business, why money gets funneled to a different point. And, I hope to do some more of these shows in the future, because I find this stuff really fast. Maybe it's just me who finds it fascinating. I don't know. I feel like this is something that people would want to hear about just a little bit. So you can follow me at the PME on Twitter, subscribe to the Mayo Media Network on YouTube for podcast versions, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast for the Pat Mayo experience. Smash the like on the way out too. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!